Betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from the mate sworn to protect you. Exiled into the freezing wilderness, a pregnant queen was left to perish by her alpha king. Years later, his royal hunt crosses paths with two fierce orphan boys who stare at his crown and utter four devastating words. Glenda Lancaster pressed her bruised knees into the unforgiving obsidian floor of the High Council chamber. Frost crept up the stained glass windows, casting fractured prisms of gray light across the grand hall, but the cold seeping into her bones came entirely from the man sitting upon the dais. Dominic Rousseau, Alpha King of the Western Reaches, looked down at her with amber eyes, completely devoid of the fierce, consuming love that had once defined their bond. Beside his massive iron-wrought chair stood Lady Catherine Hemlock, the daughter of a powerful southern duke. Catherine's delicate, gloved hand rested lightly on the armrest of Dominic's throne, a silent and venomous declaration of her victory. "The evidence is irrefutable," Dominic's voice boomed, echoing off the vaulted stone ceilings like a physical blow. He tossed a stack of parchment onto the floor. The heavy wax seals Glenda's own personal insignia of the intertwining ivy and wolf stared back at her. Letters detailing border weaknesses. Maps outlining the patrol routes of my personal guard. All addressed to the feral packs of the northern ridges. Glenda did not flinch, though her heart fractured into 1,000 jagged pieces within her chest. "They are forgeries, Dominic. You know my scent. You know my soul. I have never betrayed this kingdom, and I have never betrayed you." "Your scent is masked by the rot of your treason," Dominic snarled, leaning forward. His knuckles were white where he gripped the iron throne. The mate bond, once a warm golden tether between their minds, had been violently walled off by him weeks ago, leaving Glenda wandering in an agonizing mental silence. She knew how this had happened. Catherine had orchestrated it flawlessly, planting the treasonous documents, paying off the royal scribes, and poisoning Dominic's mind with perfectly timed whispers of Glenda's supposed dissatisfaction. But Glenda also knew something else, a secret that currently fluttered like a fragile moth deep within her womb. She was carrying the royal heirs. Her hand twitched, instinctively wanting to cover her lower abdomen, but she forced her fingers to remain curled into tight fists at her sides. If she revealed the pregnancy now, Dominic might spare her life, but Catherine would never let those children see their first winter. The Duke's daughter was ruthless, and an heir from a disgraced queen would be a loose end Catherine would happily sever. To save her unborn pups, Glenda had to accept the destruction of her own life. "I have made my decision," Dominic declared, standing to his full, towering height. The gathered lords and ladies held their breath. "Glenda of House Lancaster, I, Dominic Rousseau, Alpha of the Western Reaches, formally reject you as my Luna and my mate. I strip you of your rank, your titles, and your pack affiliation. You are hereby banished to the Frost Peak Mountains. If you step foot within the borders of my kingdom again, you will be hunted as a rogue and executed." The rejection tore through Glenda like a physical blade. A localized, agonizing fire erupted over her collarbone where his claiming mark rested, the dark ink fading rapidly until it was nothing but an angry, raised scar. She gasped, doubling over as her wolf wailed in pure, unadulterated agony, mourning the severing of their soul's counterpart. Catherine's lips curled into a triumphant smile, barely hidden behind her velvet fan. Glenda forced herself to stand. Her legs trembled, but she kept her spine rigidly straight. She looked Dominic dead in the eye, memorizing the harsh, beautiful lines of his face, mourning the man who had once brought her wildflowers in the rain. "You are condemning me to death in that winter," she whispered, her voice surprisingly steady. "But your greatest punishment, your grace, will be the day you finally realize what you threw away." Guards escorted her out of the citadel before the hour turned. She was given nothing but a woolen cloak and a small skin of water. The massive iron gates of the capital groaned shut behind her, sounding like the closing of a tomb. The journey into the Frost Peak Mountains was a descent into a frozen hell. The wind howled like mourning spirits, whipping crystalline snow against Glenda's pale skin until her cheeks bled. For 3 days and 3 nights, she trudged through snowdrifts that reached her waist. Her boots grew heavy, her breath pluming in violent, shallow gasps. By the 4th day, the starvation and sheer exhaustion began to win. She collapsed at the base of an ancient, twisted pine tree, the darkness at the edges of her vision threatening to consume her entirely. She curled into a tight ball, finally wrapping her frozen hands over her stomach. "Live," she begged her inner wolf, projecting all her fading energy inward. "Please, you must protect them." As if answering her desperate plea, a sudden, inexplicable warmth radiated from her center. The tiny sparks of life within her were radiating their own nascent lichen energy, fighting to keep their mother alive. It was a miracle of biology and magic, and it gave Glenda the strength to drag herself forward for 1 more mile. She would have died in the next snowbank if not for a weathered human woodsman named Tobias, who was checking his trapping lines near the borderline of the lichen territory. Finding a half-frozen, heavily pregnant woman buried in the powder, he carried her on his sled to a remote, hidden human settlement known as Oak Haven. There, his wife Martha, a woman with kind hands and a mastery of herbalism, spent weeks bringing Glenda back from the brink of death. Months later, in the suffocating heat of late summer, Glenda gave birth. The screams echoing from Tobias's small cabin were finally replaced by the fierce, demanding cries of 2 healthy, robust baby boys. Glenda held them to her exhausted chest. They already had tufts of thick, raven-black hair. When they opened their eyes, the brilliant, piercing shade of amber stared back at her, the exact, undeniable mirror of the Alpha King who had thrown them away. 7 years passed, burying the name Glenda Lancaster under layers of quiet, rural domesticity. In the village of Oak Haven, she was known simply as Eve, a fiercely private but deeply respected seamstress and apothecary. Her sons, Arthur and Leo, were the terror and the pride of the village. Even at 7 years old, they were uncommonly tall, moving with a predatory grace that unsettled the human children. Leo was a storm of fire and instinct. His knuckles were constantly bruised from fighting boys twice his age, who dared to mock their fatherless household. Arthur, the older twin by 4 minutes, was cold, analytical, and unnervingly quiet. He was the strategist, the one who would study a problem with those hauntingly familiar amber eyes before executing a flawless solution. Glenda spent every waking moment terrified. Their lichen heritage was beginning to manifest. When they grew angry, their fingernails hardened into sharp points, and their hearing was far too acute. She ground up wolfsbane in small, strictly measured doses, mixing it into their morning porridge to suppress their shifting instincts and mask their scent from any passing patrols. "Mother," Arthur asked one evening as he helped her wind yarn by the hearth, "why must we drink the bitter tea? The other boys do not drink it." "Because you are special, Arthur," Glenda replied, kissing his forehead. "You have a fire in your blood that must be kept banked, lest it burn the house down. If my father were here, would he have to drink it too?" Leo piped up from the rug, where he was wrestling with a large, battered wooden hound. Glenda's breath hitched. She had told them their father was a soldier who had died honorably in a great war. Yes, she lied smoothly, swallowing the lump in her throat. He drank it too. Far across the kingdom, Dominic Rousseau was a man slowly being consumed by a rotting crown. The western reaches were suffering. Crops withered on the stalks, the winters grew longer, and the rivers ran thick with toxic sludge. The elders whispered that it was the land's rejection of an incomplete alpha. Dominic had married Catherine, but the mating ceremony had felt hollow, devoid of the sacred magic that the moon goddess bestowed upon true pairings. Worse yet, Catherine had proven entirely barren. After 7 years, the kingdom had no heir, and unrest was brewing in the southern provinces. Dominic was plagued by nightmares. He would wake in a cold sweat, reaching for a woman who was no longer there, haunted by the memory of fading ink on Glenda's collarbone. He had sent scouts to the Frost Peaks years ago, secretly hoping to find her, but they had returned with nothing but the tattered, blood-stained remnants of her cloak. She was dead. He had killed his true mate, and his soul was fracturing from the guilt. To escape the suffocating walls of his citadel and the shrill complaints of his wife, Dominic often led his personal royal guard on border patrols, hunting the increasing numbers of feral rogues that dared to encroach on his lands. It was during the first frost of autumn that the rogues struck Oakhaven. They came at dusk, 6 massive, hulking beasts with mangy fur and rabid, glowing red eyes. They tore through the village square, overturning carts and shattering the fragile peace of the human settlement. Screams pierced the crisp evening air as villagers scrambled for the safety of the woods. Glenda was returning from the apothecary when the attack began. Panic seized her as she saw a massive, gray-furred rogue bounding directly toward her small cottage at the edge of the woods. "Arthur! Leo!" she screamed, dropping her basket of herbs and sprinting toward the house. But her boys were not hiding under the bed as she had taught them. The front door burst open, and Leo charged out, wielding a heavy iron fireplace poker. Behind him, Arthur stood on the porch, a tightly drawn hunting bow in his small hands, his amber eyes locked onto the massive wolf. "Stay away from our mother," Leo roared, his young voice echoing with an unnatural, booming command that carried an undeniable alpha resonance. The rogue paused, confused by the sheer authority radiating from the tiny human child. That hesitation cost the beast its advantage. Arthur released the bowstring, sending an iron-tipped arrow burying itself deeply into the rogue's front shoulder. The beast howled in fury, snapping the arrow shaft with its jaws, and lunged toward Leo. Glenda sprinted, her own dormant wolf clawing at her human skin, desperate to shift, to rip the rogue to shreds, even if it meant exposing everything. Before the rogue could reach Leo, the tree line exploded. A massive pitch-black wolf, larger than any regular lichen, vaulted over the fence. It collided with the gray rogue in midair. The sound of snapping bone and tearing flesh echoed across the yard. The black wolf was an unstoppable force of nature, ruthlessly pinning the rogue to the dirt and crushing its windpipe with a single brutal snap of its jaws. 3 more lichens burst from the woods, wearing the leather and steel armor of the royal guard, quickly dispatching the remaining rogues in the village square. The giant black wolf stood slowly, shaking the blood from its coat. It turned toward the porch, its chest heaving. Slowly, the beast shifted. Bone cracked and reformed, fur melted into skin, until Dominic Rousseau stood in the center of Glenda's destroyed garden. He was older, his face lined with deep exhaustion and a rugged beard, but his imposing, dangerous aura remained intact. Dominic wiped a streak of blood from his jaw, intending to ask the villagers if they were injured, but his words died in his throat. Standing 10 feet away from him were 2 7-year-old boys. They were not cowering, they were not crying. They were staring at him with a fearless, calculating intensity. Dominic's breath hitched. It was like looking into a mirror reflecting his own childhood. The messy raven hair, the sharp, aristocratic slope of their jawlines, and most importantly, the eyes. 2 pairs of glowing, defiant amber eyes stared back at him, identical to his own. The air grew thick, electric, with a sudden, heavy tension. The royal guards halted their approach, staring in shock at the children. Arthur lowered his bow, stepping protectively in front of his brother. He tilted his head, studying the Alpha King with an analytical precision that was painfully familiar to the man watching him. "You killed that monster," Arthur said, his voice steady and calm despite the chaos around them. "I did," Dominic managed to whisper, his heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm he hadn't felt in 7 years. He took a hesitant step forward, dropping to one knee so he was closer to their height. "Who are you?" Leo gripped his iron poker, narrowing his eyes at the heavily armored king. "Who are you?" Leo shot back defensively. "And why do you look like us?" Silence descended upon the ruined garden of Oakhaven. The only sound was the harsh, ragged breathing of the Alpha King. Dominic slowly stood up from the dirt, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the 2 young boys who stubbornly held their ground. Before he could take another step toward Arthur and Leo, A voice sliced through the crisp autumn air like a cracked whip. "Do not take another step toward my children, Dominic." Glenda emerged from the lingering smoke of the skirmish. She wore a simple linen dress, her hands stained with the green sap of healing herbs, but she carried herself with the undeniable, imperious grace of a born queen. Her chest heaved, her protective instincts flaring so violently that her eyes briefly flashed a brilliant, luminescent silver. Dominic froze. The color drained from his face, leaving his battle-hardened features completely pale. He staggered back, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "Glenda, how?" The scout said, "You perished in the frost peaks. I saw the torn cloak." "And you believed what was convenient to believe," she replied coldly. She placed a protective hand on each of her son's shoulders, pulling them slightly behind her. "You banished me to die. I survived. Now take your guards and leave my village." Lord Winston Carmichael, the captain of the Royal Guard, lowered his sword, his eyes darting between the boys and his king. "Your Grace," Winston murmured, his voice trembling with the weight of the revelation. "Those children, the resonance. It is the royal line. The kingdom has its heirs." Dominic's gaze remained locked on Glenda. The overwhelming flood of the mate bond, dormant for 7 long years, suddenly crashed against the mental walls he had built. He felt her pain, her exhaustion, and her fierce, unyielding maternal love. The truth hit him with the force of a falling mountain. She had been pregnant when he exiled her. She had endured the freezing wilderness alone, carrying his children. "I was wrong," Dominic whispered, his voice cracking. He ignored his guards, ignored the staring villagers, and fell to both knees in the dirt before her. "Glenda, I was a blind fool. Catherine, the letters. It was all a lie, wasn't it?" Arthur peeked out from behind his mother's skirt. "Is this the soldier who died honorably in the Great War, Mother?" he asked, his sharp mind connecting the pieces of the puzzle with devastating accuracy. Dominic flinched, as if struck physically. "A dead soldier?" he repeated, looking up at Glenda with a tortured expression. "It was a kinder truth than telling them their father threw them out into the snow like garbage," Glenda spat, her voice laced with years of suppressed bitterness. "You have no claim here, Your Grace. Your crown means nothing in Oakhaven. The rogues will return," Dominic pleaded, desperation bleeding into his tone. "The attack today was not random. Feral packs do not strike human settlements unless they are tracking a specific scent. They were hunting the boys, Glenda. Their lichen heritage is manifesting, and the wolfsbane you are feeding them is failing to mask their alpha aura. If you stay here, they will be slaughtered." Glenda knew he was right. The sheer size of the rogue that attacked their cottage was proof that Oakhaven was no longer safe. Her sons needed the protection of a fortress, the training of seasoned warriors, and the security of a true pack. "We will go to the Citadel," Glenda finally agreed, her voice hard and uncompromising. "But hear me well, Dominic Rousseau. I am returning for the safety of my sons, not for you. I am not your Luna, and I am not your mate." The journey back to the western reaches was a grueling, tense affair. Dominic rode alongside their carriage, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line, guarding them with a fierce, possessive paranoia. When the massive iron gates of the capital finally loomed in the distance, Arthur and Leo pressed their faces against the carriage glass, staring in awe at the towering stone spires. Inside the High Council chamber, Lady Catherine Hemlock was holding court, draped in extravagant silks. She was lecturing the northern lords about taxation when the heavy oak doors were violently thrown open. Dominic strode into the grand hall, his presence commanding absolute silence. Behind him walked Glenda, her head held high, flanked by 2 young boys who possessed the undeniable, terrifying visage of the Alpha King. Catherine dropped her jeweled goblet. The heavy gold clattered against the obsidian floor, echoing through the stunned, breathless chamber. The false queen's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. Chaos erupted in the High Council chamber. Lords and ladies whispered frantically, pointing at the 2 boys who stood with straight spines and calculating eyes. Catherine scrambled down from the dais, her silk skirts dragging across the floor. "Dominic, what is the meaning of this? Why have you brought this traitor back into our halls? And who are these filthy human street urchins?" Leo growled, a surprisingly deep, rumbling sound that made several seasoned warriors step back, his fingernails elongated into sharp points. "Speak carefully, Catherine," Dominic warned, his voice a low, lethal hum. "You are addressing the rightful heirs of the Western Reaches, and you are speaking to the woman who should have never been stripped of her crown." Panic flared in Catherine's eyes, but she quickly masked it with indignation. "She committed treason." "The letters were forged," Arthur interrupted. The 7-year-old boy stepped forward, his amber eyes analyzing the panicked woman with cold precision. "Mother taught me how to read royal ciphers last winter. We reviewed the old council transcripts you brought in the carriage, King Dominic. The wax seal on the treasonous letters was stamped over the folded parchment, but the ink inside bled through the creases. That means the letters were written after the seal was stolen and applied to blank paper." The council chamber went deathly silent. Lord Winston Carmichael stepped forward, his eyes widening. "The boy is right. I reviewed those documents years ago, but we never noticed the ink bleed. Only someone with unrestricted access to the Queen's chambers could have stolen her personal seal." Glenda watched her son with immense pride. Arthur had indeed studied the files Dominic provided during the journey, proving his genius intellect. "Lies!" Catherine shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Glenda. "She has trained these bastards to spout nonsense. Guards, seize them!" Not a single guard moved. The royal soldiers looked exclusively to Dominic. Sensing the collapse of her empire, Catherine's facade finally shattered. That night, desperate and cornered, she arranged a covert meeting in the palace dungeons with Lord Gregory Harrington, a corrupt noble who had helped her forge the original letters. "We must eliminate the boys," Catherine hissed in the damp darkness. "Slip Nightshade into their supper. If the heirs die, Dominic will be forced to keep me." "You are too late, Lady Catherine," a voice echoed from the shadows of the dungeon corridor. Dominic stepped into the torchlight, his eyes glowing with unrestrained fury. Beside him stood Arthur and Leo, both entirely unbothered by the darkness. "Did you really think my sons would not hear you plotting from 3 corridors away?" Dominic asked, his voice dripping with venom. "Their hearing is sharper than any warrior in my guard." "You set a trap," Catherine whispered, her face pale. "We simply followed the scent of fear and rot," Leo said with a smirk, crossing his small arms. Dominic motioned to Lord Winston. "Arrest Lord Gregory Harrington for conspiracy. As for Catherine of House Hemlock, your treason runs deeper than framing my mate." The feral rogues that attacked Oakhaven were carrying a scent identical to the perfume oils you import from the south. "You hired the rogues to hunt my family when your spies discovered they were still alive." Catherine fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. "I did it for us, Dominic. She was weak. I was meant to be your true queen." "You are nothing but a parasite," Dominic snarled. "I strip you of your titles. You are banished to the Frost Peak Mountains, precisely where you sent my true mate. You will face the winter without a cloak, without food, and without mercy." The guards dragged the screaming, thrashing Catherine away, her cries echoing through the cold stone halls until they faded into nothingness. The next morning, the kingdom felt lighter, as if a toxic cloud had been lifted from the land. The winter sun shone brightly through the stained glass windows of the High Council chamber. Dominic stood before the throne, but he did not sit. He turned to Glenda, who stood by the balcony overlooking the bustling courtyard. Her sons were down below, Arthur reading a massive tome of kingdom law, while Leo gleefully wrestled with a squad of heavily armored guards. "They are extraordinary," Dominic said softly, stepping up beside her. "You raised 2 kings, Glenda. You gave them strength, wisdom, and survival. Everything I failed to give you." Glenda looked at him. The arrogant, cold alpha who had banished her was gone, replaced by a broken man desperate for redemption. The mate bond between them was still fractured. heavily scarred by years of pain, but the faint, golden warmth of it was beginning to pulse once more. "Forgiveness is not a switch that can be flipped, Dominic," Glenda said quietly, turning her gaze back to her sons. "The scars you left run deep. You broke our family before it even began." "I know," Dominic murmured, bowing his head. "I do not ask for your forgiveness today, nor tomorrow. I will spend the rest of my life proving that I am worthy of the title of their father, and perhaps one day, worthy of being your mate again." Glenda watched Leo tackle a guard twice his size, his joyous laughter ringing through the air. She felt a profound sense of peace settle over her soul. The winter of her rejection was finally over. The frost had melted, and from the frozen earth, her family was finally ready to bloom. She reached out, her fingers lightly brushing against Dominic's calloused hand. It was a small gesture, a tiny spark of hope, but for the Alpha King, it was everything. "We have a kingdom to heal, Dominic," she said softly. "Let us begin." Conclusion. Did Glenda make the right choice by giving the Alpha King a second chance? Or should she have ruled the kingdom entirely on her own? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this dramatic tale of betrayal, revenge, and redemption, please hit that like button, share it with your fellow fantasy romance fans, and subscribe to our channel for more epic, thrilling werewolf stories every single week.